Uh, so hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules. I know that you all have a lot of different competing challenges and deadlines, so I appreciate you taking time today. Today we are going to take a high-level view of the landscape of children's mental health services in North Carolina. And my name is Janu Cost. I'm going to be the moderator today. I'm also on the Juvenile Justice and Children's Rights Advisory Council here at North Carolina Bar Association. So just a little way of background of how I came to think of this particular panel today and what I hope you will take away from it. Some very important topic. And as you can see, I'm wearing green because it is Mental Health Awareness Month. So this is a great time to have this topic. It is timely. So again, my name is Janu Cost. I'm currently an Assistant Attorney General. I provide litigation services for the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, primarily in the Healthcare Personnel Registry section, as well as the Facility Licensure section. Prior to this position, I was an attorney at Disability Rights North Carolina for 4.5 years. When I first arrived there, I spent the first 2 years as an Equal Justice Works Fellow, and my entire focus was on advocating for children with dual diagnoses. So they have been diagnosed with both a mental health challenge, as well as either an intellectual or developmental disability, and helping them to transition from institutional placements into the community. And part of that led me to working across many different legal areas. So in advocating for children, I was interacting with school systems and school attorneys. Oftentimes these were children who were justice system involved, as well as involved with child welfare systems, either having been adopted out of a Department of Social Services or currently in the care of Department of Social Services, and also working through the Medicaid system. So through this work, after the 2-year fellowship ended, I stayed on for another 2.5 years to continue the work. I got to see across many different areas of legal practice how mental health can be a nexus point for all of this interaction and all of these different decisions. And over time, I also became kind of known throughout these different communities as a person that could speak to how disability and mental health apply to these different areas. So I would get calls oftentimes for legal advice, technical assistance to other attorneys. And so I would speak with juvenile justice attorneys who would say, you know, I'm fearful that the court will ask that the child, have this in the disposition. I don't feel that's right. That's not what my client wants. What are your thoughts? How can I bring this before the judge and help the judge understand the placement decision? Or a guardian ad litem saying, this is the placement decision that's been made. My child, I think, would do better here. I think it would be in the best interest of the child to be in a different setting. Can you help me understand how the Medicaid system works and who I need to speak to? I would get questions from attorneys all the time about where to find certain types of information and documentation that they could bring forward in court as part of whatever court hearing they were part of. So I was involved tangentially with many different cases throughout the state, and just helping those attorneys kind of fit in the disability component into whatever the practice area was that they were needing that help. And so, as we know, as attorneys, we are not experts in mental health. I think very few of us have a background in child and adolescent psychology or social work or psychiatry or medicine. And so therefore we rely on advocates and experts in the field to help guide us as we are trying to advocate in a courtroom or a settlement for the best outcome for our client. And so today I'm so happy to introduce you to two of my experts, two people that I found invaluable in the work that I did at Disability Rights, and who to this day I do consult with. So first, I would like to introduce you to Kirby Morrow. So Kirby Morrow currently is an advocate at Disability Rights North Carolina. She obtained her bachelor's degree in social work and psychology from Western Carolina University, her master's degree in social work from Florida International University, and her certificate in healthcare advocacy from University of Miami. She has over 30 years of experience working with children and families and adults in mental health systems, with 5 at Disability Rights, North Carolina. She assisted in creating the Children with Complex Needs litigation by identifying clients with autism and complex needs to support the creation of a neurodiverse therapy that would meet the needs of these individuals. And one of her best assets is she can identify system gaps, and then she can support in how do we mitigate these gaps for our clients. She's primarily focused on the rights of individuals to live free of abuse and to be supported in the least restrictive environment so they can have a complete life of their choosing. And before this, she also brings to her vast experience working with homeless housing programs, establishing best practices focused on improving foster care systems. She's also worked in gang task force, addressing racial inequality and substance abuse counseling for adults and youth. So as you can see, vast knowledge and expertise, and it was really a privilege working alongside her. She was an invaluable asset, to much of my work. And then I would also like to introduce you to Dr. Paul Lanier. I did not have the privilege of working directly with Dr. Lanier. However, I consulted his peer-reviewed journal articles all the time. And I also referred them to other attorneys who were trying to understand these systems. I would send them links and I would send them to these papers so that they could bring these papers forward with them when they were, asserting a position in court to talk about the evidence behind it. So Dr. Lanier has a master's in social work. He has a PhD and is a professor at the School of Social Work at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He received his undergraduate and master's in social work from UNC Chapel Hill and his PhD in social work from the Brown School of Washington University in St. Louis. At UNC, he is the principal investigator for Behavioral Health Springboard and the director for Behavioral Health Services and Systems Research at the Cecil Gill Shepp Center for Health Service Research. His research focuses on developing and evaluating and scaling up evidence-based prevention programs and policies in child welfare, behavioral health, and early childhood systems. So as you can see, we have 2 people with impeccable credentials who have vast knowledge. And really, if nothing else from this today, I hope that you will seek these 2 individuals out when you have questions in the future for the work that you're doing. Because as we know, mental health itself is not a legal issue, but it is part of the landscape that so many of us are working with when we're advocating for children and families across our state. So with that, we'll launch into our program for today. So what I did in creating these questions for our experts is we're going to have 2 questions to really lay a foundation. Like I said, that high level view of what is this system. And then I'm going to bring to them some of the common questions that I would get when I was at Disability Rights North Carolina from attorneys practicing in the field. And so they will be able to give you some of their answers to those. And like I said, I hope that this starts a conversation that doesn't end today. So first question, we'll start with Ms. Morrow on this, but I know that Dr. Lanier also has input on this question. So Ms. Morrow, can you please give us an overview of what the public mental health and behavioral health system is? Where do children enter this system? And how do they access treatment from providers through this system?
So we utilize a system of managed care. And I'll ask Brianne to maybe put up the map for me. There are local management entities that cover regions, and those regions are identified here. So you can see that Via Health has a very large area in the light blue, and then Partners in the darker blue. Then you have a little bit of a disjointed look at Alliance.
Just leave the video off.
At Alliance, so they have Charlotte, Mecklenburg area, and then they have the counties surrounding Orange, Durham, Wake, Chapel Hill area. What is it? Yeah, those ones in light purple, and then the green area. This is a new area which used to be divided into 3 other managed care organizations, which were Sandhills, East Point, and Trillium. Now that the entire green area is under one umbrella, Trillium. So a family would contact the managed care organization and request care coordination for their child. Now that there is a caveat to that, and that is that these are Medicaid-driven services. It doesn't mean that if you have private insurance that you're unable to access those, but at the end of the day, you still would probably need support through your managed care just to find the local resources, but you would want to check with your private insurer to see if what options were available to you in terms of our system of care. Our system is heavily driven by Medicaid services as well as waiver type services. So if your child has an intellectual developmental disability or meets criteria in 3 categories of meeting for an intellectual developmental disability, remember IQ is only one standard, then they can be put on a waiver wait list for the innovations waiver. Innovations waiver provides up to $187,000 a year towards the care of that individual. And it's all done on sliding scale and based on assessments that are completed by your managed care entities. There is also the ability to access a CAP-C waiver. But the CAP-C and CAP-DA waivers, CAP-C is for children, CAP-DA is for adults. Those are accessed differently. They are not done through the management entity. They are usually done through, and you can find them online, like different places that may have somebody that can help you complete that application. Oftentimes there's a person at DSS that can assist you. Income caps are 1217. So if you have an income of over 1217 and it is not because, and it doesn't go over because of a death benefit or an added benefit of a parent retiring or something like that, where you're receiving an additional benefit on top of what you would normally get, which then can create a way to go around that deductible, because there would be a deductible if you're over that amount. However,
Kirby, can you just let people know what the waiver is? Because I know a lot of people are familiar with Medicaid, and a lot of the kids that we advocate for utilize that. But how is a waiver different than Medicaid?
So a waiver is very honed in on very specific types of services that will meet the individual's needs, whether that is a housing need, supportive housing, or supportive living rather, would be under innovations. So you have like supportive living, you have community integration, employment supports, you have personal care supports. So there's somebody that can work with you along a spectrum of different areas. For example, it could be in-home working on your activities of daily living. It could be in the community, learning how to budget, how to purchase items, how to socialize, how to do many different things. In a public setting, supportive employment would give you, somebody with you to help you, walk through a volunteer opportunity or a small job of some kind. And so it just really is the waivers give you a concentrated amount of hours based on your assessment. We do have services that support people that are not on the innovations waiver, and that is called 1915I. So it used to be B3 services, and they're now called 1915I, which requires an assessment, and then you can obtain some level of services, just not as robust or intense.
So just a clarifying question, Kirby. If someone has a client that has been identified with mental health issues, they suspect that the client has perhaps an intellectual or developmental disability, or vice versa, can their client get both services? Can they get Medicaid services as well as these waiver services?
Yes, they can. You can stack services to a certain extent. And and it gives you a lot of creative leeway when you have the waiver. When you don't have the waiver, you're a little more locked into some services, but if it's a child and they are under the age of 21, then EPSDT applies, which I do have a slide for somewhere in here. And that is early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment. And that is basically Children's Medicaid 0 to 21. And that is the federal program versus the managed care programs. So if it is a medically necessary service and a doctor signs off that it is medically necessary, then that is something that can be fought for and obtained. If you suspect that somebody has a developmental disability and they have not been diagnosed, then I recommend getting a very good assessment. We have a lot of rural counties, and that can be a challenge. You may need to go out of county to get a robust assessment. Places like the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities at Chapel Hill, Teach is one that is part of, they do specifically very much autism testing. Duke Center for Autism. And then there's a lot of good individual providers that can do full educational and psychological evaluations. The most important at this point is also ensuring that there is an adaptive functioning scale, because that is being heavily weighed into into the decision about whether you meet criteria for what we call the Registry of Unmet Needs. So waivers are a loose term. There is a 15,000, I think we're almost at 15,000, and we may have reduced it a little bit, person wait list for the waiver. However, there are ways to around that list, and that would be anything that can trigger it as an emergency. The child continues to have accelerated behavioral problems and is getting repeatedly hospitalized. You can often ask for an emergency waiver slot. There is also the use of money follows the person, MFP, and that allows you to access either CAP-C, which is for children with more of a medical problem, medical issues that need to be addressed, and the innovations, those are separate waivers. They do not overlap. So it's like a either or, but money follows the person. You can access what you need through that. So you might need a CAP-C waiver. You may not need the innovations waiver, but if you do, then that's something you can access through that.
So Kirby, if one of our attorneys has a client and they recognize that this client has a developmental disability, but they don't have a waiver, right? This comes up a lot. What could the attorney do to ensure that this child can access these services through our public system if they suspect that, maybe this is a kid who has that developmental disability? Part of the issue they're seeing is that the services aren't in place. You've got a behavior or manifesting or something along those lines, and that waiver services could be one way to bring in the services, during a disposition. How would they do that? Who would they need to talk to?
They would need to talk to the local management entity for that region and get a good assessment to then identify whether the child or individual qualifies for the Registry of Unmet Needs, which is the wait list, or that I would say that's probably the point of least resistance here. An IEP, an individualized education plan, which oftentimes the kids have, may also provide that information. You may be able to utilize the assessment that was done by the school, but a lot of times those are very rushed, and I don't know that you get a good capture. So if somebody was in on the line, or a borderline edge, but remember, IQ is only one criteria. This is an age-old fight for us. There are, I think we've got it down to 6 criteria, and you have to meet 3 of those criteria. And so that would be like processing speed is extremely slow. They cannot attend activities of daily living. They cannot manage money, or nor does it appear that they would ever be able to do so very well in the future. They are unable to maneuver social situations or do and acclimate to social situations, or they have, really problematic behaviors that interfere with their ability to fully be integrated into a more general setting.
And then one last question, and then we'll I know that Dr. Lanier has quite a few slides that deal with prevalencies, et cetera, for our region. But if someone is serving a child, and they identify that the child has a lot of mental health needs, usually in conjunction with IDD needs, what is the door? Who do you speak to say, I would like to make sure that we can have this child have an appropriate set of services?
So again, I would go to the managed care entity, and now they also have tailored care plans that we're launching here in a minute. And some people already have them. So tailored care plans are just agencies that are outside of the managed care organization that are still managing your care in the same way, but they are sort of an in between, they're a third party. So the idea was to provide somebody that wasn't necessarily working directly for the insurance company, but was more working for the individual and the family. So sometimes that feels more appealing. It's like sleeping with the enemy. Sort of that's how the feeling is sometimes. Like you feel like you don't know if you're getting all the information, because at the end of the day, insurance companies are very much meant to save or restrict funds based on what they don't feel is necessary, but doctors drive what's necessary. So getting that good assessment, having a doctor sign off that these are needed services, getting the support and care coordination and getting the case management support you need will then drive those service needs and figure out what is specific to your individual. Are they somebody that can benefit fully, even if they have severe mental health issues? That could be trauma based. Trauma kids do not need to be shoved into talk therapy right away. They need things that help them regulate their brain. They can't stay out of fight or flight, which is why we see often behaviors as a use of, become their communication. And they're communicating how to get away from a situation or how to avoid a situation, because there's not a lot of trust that has been built between them and the adults in their lives oftentimes.
Right. And
So,
I think as attorneys, we see that unfortunately way too often.
right.
All right, Kirby, I'm going to pause you there, and I'm going to just check in with Dr. Lanier. I know that you had a few comments on this particular question as well.
Sure, thanks. I was enjoying listening to Kirby talk. It's great to have someone who knows so much about the day-to-day aspects and the details of all these policies and how they get implemented in kind of the real-world situations. I'm going to talk about this a little bit from more of maybe the academic research perspective, and just want to say at the top, thanks for inviting me to come speak with y'all. It's really important to have this conversation, especially right now in North Carolina. There's a lot changing. It's a very active area of policy change. A lot of us are talking about this as kind of a once in a generation change in our mental health, behavioral health systems more broadly. I had some slides, Brianna. Thank you. And yeah, so I'm at UNC Chapel Hill, but I did want to mention, so I worked in 3 years in residential treatment here in North Carolina, and spent a fun year at Dorothea Dix in the crisis stabilization unit when I was in my MSW training program. So I've seen a little bit of this on the ground, but have been a little more removed in recent years. So, all right, next slide. So first, what I was going to do, and I'm an academic, I can't go anywhere without some slides, and it's summertime. I don't have students right now, so I have a captive audience. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes if that's okay. And then I think we'll definitely have more questions and conversation, but wanted to give you my kind of, again, high level view of what's going on in North Carolina right now, because I'm sure you see this kind of every single day in the things Kirby's talking about in terms of access to services, unmet need, et cetera. So we have a perfect storm going on right now. You can choose the metaphor that works best for you, but we have increasing need and decreasing supply of services, which yields a situation where a lot of kids, and I'm focusing on the child behavioral health system, are getting no or low quality treatment. So we could obviously spend hours kind of unpacking what's going on right now, kind of more broadly from a public health perspective, but just wanted to provide this as a link here for the North Carolina Child Behavioral Health dashboard that the state has released recently. So you can look at some trends across a few indicators over recent years, kind of by different demographics, geographic areas. But to me, this one data point we could look at, there's dozens of them, sticks out to me. So you ask high school kids in North Carolina, did you feel sad or hopeless? And not just do you feel sad or hopeless like every now and then, but for 2 weeks straight so that you could not continue your regular activities. So not a diagnosis of clinical depression, but kind of approaching that level of sadness or hopelessness that we don't want to see out of our high school students here in North Carolina. And going back to 2015, you can see this number's been increasing. So when people say this was not just a COVID thing, that the trends were kind of going in the wrong directions, you can see in North Carolina specifically, we saw that with this indicator. And also just wanted to pull out the differences for males and females in North Carolina, because again, there's a lot of, depending on what condition you're talking about, what externalizing or internalizing disorders, you'll see different groups affected differentially. So for example, this one you see it's over half for females, and it's a little bit lower for males in North Carolina. All right, next slide. So that's a bit on the increasing need. So you see increases in all the kind of symptoms, diagnoses, et cetera, across the state going on, whether you look at the general population or the Medicaid population specifically. And then you have this issue of not enough supply. We don't have enough providers. It's a workforce is like the number one thing I think people are thinking about right now. Here's some data. This happens to be about psychologists. You could look at a similar thing for psychiatrists or for social workers or any kind of licensed therapist, but we do not have enough of them in North Carolina, and they're not distributed well in our rural populations specifically. So there's 29 counties that don't have a single psychologist in their county at all. And if you look over time on the right, going back to 2000, we haven't really made much progress in this area. And this one's for psychologists. And even if you look at kind of the percent 65 or older or percent unrepresented minority, we're not doing a good job of having recruiting populations that may connect well with younger kids across our state and our diverse state population. So issues with supply of providers right now, big time in North Carolina. Next slide. This one is just kind of to make the point, you're probably familiar with this, but when we think about the mental health system, it's a continuum of services. And we are only as strong as our weakest link, right? So if we're not investing in prevention services, so things like mental health first aid in our schools, in churches, et cetera, across the state, community organizations, we will see the effects of that in the more higher restrictive services in the emergency departments, et cetera. So you can think of promotion, prevention. We're hanging out kind of in the treatment and recovery phase, but just making the point here that we need a strong kind of system overall. Next slide. It's, I'm going to talk it in a minute. Was asked to kind of mention things about evidence-based interventions. So generally speaking, this is kind of a version of a pyramid looking at the different types of services we'll offer in North Carolina, starting at the bottom, kind of informal self-care, up to primary care based. So going, your pediatrician, family medicine, family doctor office, some interventions there. Medication treatment is an important part of, treating a lot of psychiatric conditions. Then the community mental health evidence-based treatment. So these kind of therapeutic outpatient services. And then you get in the red zone. Okay, so we'll talk some about PRTFs, psychiatric residential treatment facilities, but then hospitals and EDs. When you have a child who's not in their home environment anymore or in their community environment anymore, they're in an institutional setting. There is very little evidence that children placed in residential or institutional settings is an effective way to treat mental health conditions, period. Now, you can deliver some intervention, some therapeutic practices in those settings that may be effective, but by and large, these are not treatment interventions, these are settings, okay? So we'll talk some more about that, but just as we're thinking about these levels of care, whether it's from a child welfare perspective, they overlap with the mental health perspective as well. Next slide. We have been doing some work with our research projects to try to understand the complexity of these systems in North Carolina and how it's producing some of the results we're seeing. So right now, you're probably familiar with this. There are, it's getting better, but a lot of youth in foster care who are staying and boarded in emergency departments, DSS offices, hotels, etc. So we did essentially focus groups. This is system dynamics modeling with lots of providers, individuals with lived experiences, etc. Last summer to try to understand this. And I'm not going to try to unpack this, but if you were immediately, when Kirby was talking, saying, oh my gosh, this is so complicated, and this is probably the water you swim in every single day, this is kind of what it looks like just for this one problem. It's extremely complicated. When we presented this data back to the therapists and the attorneys, the people we talked to, they said, this is what I'm carrying around in my head every day when I'm trying to get services for a kid. This is part of the problem. It's incredibly complex. So I just want to kind of put that out there and normalize it, that this is a very difficult situation we're in. And then the day-to-day, trying to figure out, do I apply for this waiver or get this service, or who's going to pay for it? Is it going to be Medicaid? Is it going to be DSS, et cetera? It's because this is how our system's been designed. It's very, very complicated. But a lot of it has to do with the lack of access to effective community-based treatment. Next slide. That's that little box right there. Okay, so this is from a paper that has just published this month in the North Carolina Medical Journal. If you're interested more about PRTFs and the trends that we're seeing. So in North Carolina over the past several years, the red line is the percentage of youth in PRTFs who are also involved in foster care service or in the foster care system, right? So this overlap between foster care and child welfare systems, there's a codependency there, right? So if there's a lack of foster care providers and other services in the foster care system, we will see utilization of our residential treatment services increase. The dotted line is the out of state. So, 6 years ago, maybe like 1 in 4 kids were being sent out of state for residential treatment. Now it's almost half of them are. Okay, so if we have a lack of residential providers and community-based treatment in North Carolina, the kids will need to have services somewhere. So now we are sending them out of state at a higher rate. So just showing some trends and kind of what our system is doing to produce some of these trends potentially. Next slide. I've got a couple more here. Just wanted to talk for a minute about, again, these are about evidence-based treatments for youth. And this is where you can get into another kind of alphabet soup of TFCBTs and MSTs, et cetera. But again, generally, we're talking about interventions that can be delivered by a trained professional using a manual that have been studied rigorously through randomized trials and other kind of scientific methods, right? So just kind of 3 things overall, and Kirby mentioned this, like trauma-informed care has got to be foundational to all of this. Trauma-informed systems, trauma-informed therapy, whatever it is, when we're talking about youth mental health, not every single time, but in general, there's some sort of traumatic experience that has not always been kind of a centerpiece of how we've done, how we've developed systems, for sure. So that's kind of in general something to keep in the back of your mind. We also can assume that there's no silver bullets. Results may vary. There is not a program, if we just implement it in North Carolina, all of our problems will be solved. You all know this, every situation is different, every kid is different. There may be a sequence to doing treatments in a certain way. We need to have a continuum, an array of options that can be used readily across the state. And last, every child should be receiving evidence-based treatment. There's no excuse why we could not have an evidence-based intervention in every county, every corner of our state that's available. We don't see that right now. It is not a thing. So when we look at the data and see kids that are going to emergency departments and PRTFs, and look, the year before, we should see lots of service utilization of these evidence-based interventions. And we just don't see that in all cases. So how do we know what's effective? What does the evidence support? I'm going to mention just kind of a couple national clearinghouses, and then I definitely think you'll have these slides. But just as you're kind of looking at what's effective, you can look at the next slide. One I like to go to a lot is the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for child welfare specifically. So this is specific to child welfare systems. They review all the evidence. And they have a whole topic around disruptive behavior treatment. So like what works for oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, ADHD, and you can kind of click through and see different types of interventions and see what do we have in our state that's available, what's available in my community. Next slide. So I just pulled a few of these out. So here's like an MFC, treatment foster care or therapeutic foster care, multidimensional family therapy. So if you're trying to understand, like when someone starts talking about MST that was tried, or if we can get an MST, these clearinghouses are good resources to really understand kind of in a quick distillation of what these programs are. Next slide. There's a lot going on in the healthcare system. There's also a lot going on in the child welfare system. So, Title IV-E funds is, funding that's used to pay for foster care. And recently, the Family First Prevention Services Act was passed at the federal level. And again, a once-in-a-generation change to how we can use Title IV-E funds. So they're now able to be used more for prevention services. North Carolina is kind of rolling out its plan right now. Same thing here. You can go on their website, pick an area, see what's well supported, what's promising, et cetera. And last slide, got to give a shout out for the North Carolina Child Treatment Program. Hopefully everyone is familiar with this. We were so fortunate to have this as a resource in our state. It's funded by the General Assembly. Their job is to train and coach providers in evidence-based practices. A few of them listed here. And then I highlight down here at the bottom from their website, they do treatment in restricted settings, including juvenile justice and PRTFs, right? So we have some of the pieces here. We have the building blocks in our state. We got a long way to go though. So that was it for my introductory comments, if you would.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lanier and Ms. Morrow. I feel like we have set a very good table for this conversation. And I just want to lift up Judge Bottenheimer's comment, and I do want to invite anyone who has questions to just drop them into the chat. I've been looking through them. It says, notably, no one is advocating for foster kids by filing special education petitions at Office of Administrative Hearings. These children surely have IEPs and BIPs because of their mental health. If they're not getting appropriate mental health services, most likely they're not receiving a free and appropriate education in the public school system. And that is that nexus, right? We see a kid, they pop up into this legal system because underlying it, they have a mental health condition, potentially some other type of learning disability. But then, there's a behavior in the classroom, which escalates to this being a juvenile justice matter, or, they're already in the child welfare system and they're, moving between placements because of quote unquote, the behavioral issues of the child needing to be moved. And so we see all of these issues really having that commonality of the unmet need for the mental health services. And so that's actually a perfect segue into some of the common questions that I received when I was at Disability Rights. Usually it would start with an attorney basically calling me and saying, this just doesn't feel right. And then putting out the question, because again, we're not trained like our two guests are in clinical work, but just to the eye and to talking with the children, just something's not quite right here, or just having a general question about kind of options that they may have to sort through in a hearing or in some sort of dispositional matter. So the first question I would get a lot of times is, can a child receive mental health services in a non-mental health licensed foster home? Okay, so there are different types of group homes in our state. We have those that are licensed by the Department of Health and Human Services as mental health group homes. And then those that are licensed as social services group homes. They're licensed under completely different statutes and overseen by different agencies. And so legally, a foster home that is licensed under DSS cannot also itself offer mental health services. But if a child is in that placement, can they get mental health services?
Yes, they can. They can get services. But what we often see is There's a lot of racial disparity in what we're speaking about too. Black and brown kids are disproportionately unidentified for IEPs and BIPs. Their behaviors are more likely to be adjudicated. Kids in foster care systems rarely are given educational surrogates or somebody that is there at all times. I literally had a DSS worker and a group home not show up to an IEP for a young man who has an intellectual disability, is 17, will be aging out of the system, and he lost his IEP. They just took it away because nobody was there to say no. So when these kids don't have anybody to stand for them or to care that their rights were violated, we have a systemic issue in a specific mountain county that is extremely obvious. All the kids at this group home, all the kids that have IEPs are basically being very much marginalized. They're trying to create an alternative school, which to me just means prison pipeline. And we keep escalating these systems, or we dump them in beds. So something that Paul Lanier was speaking to here was, this is an issue where we have all these kids being placed out of state, being placed in state, going here, going there, dumped in EDs. And when I say dumped, I mean, there is no other, they're not identifying any option to get them out of that scenario. So that burdens the emergency department, creates another level of disparity here, because they don't maybe meet criteria to be in that emergency department, but there's no other bed. And when I have a parent ask me if the bed is the name of a facility, I struggle with that because they are trying to find a bed. They're not talking about the right bed for that child. A lot of these out-of-state placements and a lot of the PRTFs are privately owned facilities. They are not paying their front line well. These are not well-trained staff. They are not trauma-informed. They are, much of this gets driven by their egos and the problematic behaviors of kids that are already being placed in there who get mouthy. Those things happen. Kids are going to push back. I mean, that's just a natural part of this type of a process, especially when they feel trapped, when they feel like they don't have a voice. And these facilities are not helping them to get better.
And so
I think that's a big issue.
And so at the beginning, you did say, because this is like what happens if we don't get the services, right? Like you have a child who was placed in a group home and they have the identified need, but they're not getting the services. So here's the outflow from that. If you're an attorney and you see a child, you're serving a child who's in a group home, you can look and say, yeah, this kid really does need some services, to help, we can put this up for a disposition in his, juvenile justice case. Is that something then, even though they're in a group home setting, that's not a licensed group home setting, could an advocate go to the MCO and say, this kid needs some outpatient, individualized therapy? Would that be considered like out of line or double billing or anything like that?
No, that's not double billing, because the group home is only going to be billing under one specific type of code if they don't have a therapeutic level of service there. So they're going to be billing for bed rates. They're going to be billing for, maybe a group, maybe some outing or something like that, but they're not going to be billing for a therapeutic service if they don't have an inclusive therapeutic service on site. So those services would be provided in a separate setting outside of the home, which to me is actually positive. If you can find one.
Yeah, I was going to just totally agree with that. And I just want to, again, stress and underline how important the MCOs, the managed care organizations, and I put the link to the new Taylor plans that I think officially roll out July 1st in North Carolina. Their job is to coordinate these services and make sure that was the deal that we made, the state of North Carolina made when we privatized Medicaid, was that these companies would do this for our kids. So it's not just like, could they, is it okay if they should be doing it? That is their responsibility. We have something called a system of care philosophy. So in the best case scenario, everyone comes around, the school, child welfare, pediatrician, family, community, friend, whoever it is, and wraps this kid around with all this support, and someone's got to coordinate that. So when we've done our work, a lot of it has been like, there's no bad guy in the system. Everyone's doing exactly what they're supposed to do, but no one's holding it all together. Well, in theory, the MCOs, these plans, if they're on Medicaid or you're insured, that is their job to be doing that.
Great. And that's so important to underscore. Kirby,
I
I know you want to add.
I do.
You're fine. You add one thing, and then I'm just going to pivot, because right now we're talking about kind of DSS world. Then I have the follow-up question is more of the DJJ world. So please.
Well, and in this will cross into that, because oftentimes we have kids that have sexualized issues because they were victims. And so most victims become perpetrators. This is what protects me from having awful fantasies about things. But at the end of the day, you have to understand that most perpetrators were victims. So then their answer is a place called Piney Ridge, for example, in Arkansas. Let me be crystal clear. They do not take they don't take Arkansas Medicaid. Want to know why? Because that keeps them off the radar of the people in their state, and they just become a business that's running there. A business that is not known for helping kids. In fact, the absolute opposite has been found. Investigations have been done, evidence has been compiled. We've pulled kids against medical advice out of there as quickly as we could, because these kids are getting more damaged. And a lot of the private facilities that you find in out-of-state placements, which our kids that are in the DSS and DJJ system can disproportionately languish in for much more extended periods of time than they should be there. I mean, I don't really think anybody should ever be in there longer than 3 months. These should be stabilization. It should be about getting them engaged in services and reintegrating them back into their community as quickly as possible. A lot of these kids get way too used to these institutional settings and they become comfortable. So I say all of that just to say the cautionary tale is keep your kids in your jurisdictions and in state.
Yes, absolutely. And Kirby and I did a lot of work together on the kids going out of state, which leads us to the issue on the DJJ side as well of things. So again, I just want to situate this question is that, as you saw on the slides that Dr. Lanier presented, because we're lacking services in our state, it forces a lot of kids to be placed out of state and be placed in potentially higher levels of restriction than what clinically required if they could actually get the services here. So one question that I would get a lot from juvenile defenders would be the child would come up for disposition and there would be a recommendation for Youth Development Center and a recommendation for a PRTF. And this is codified under our new laws. And so they would ask me, well, what's better or what's worse? As they're trying to think through their defense strategy, as they're trying to think through what they're going to be asking for the court, they're weighing what's being recommended by clinicians, they're weighing what's being recommended by court counselors. So in your opinions, and I want to be sensitive to time because we're 8 minutes left. How would you answer that question? Because that's really one of these impossible kind of positions that so many of attorneys who are practicing, are in, and kids. It's like, this is we're going either to YDC or we're going to a PRTF. What should we be going for?
Honestly, I think that this is, no matter what, you need to be looking at this child as a whole person and the vulnerability of a child in certain scenarios. Like I've been in detentions for kids that were horrible. I've also been in some that were actually pretty well run. had educational services being provided, outdoor time being provided. Didn't remind me of youth Sing Sing, things like that. And I think that there's some caveat to saying, like, as long as we're not looking at really long term for either of these services, trying to get these kids back into their communities and not maintaining in a system that really directs them towards, prison or more significant mental health issues on either side. You're kind of looking at like increased trauma on both sides. Dr. Lanier, do you have, that's
Totally
a hard
agree.
one.
Yeah, no, that's an awful bargain at that point when you're making the decision. So I would make sure that no stone had been left unturned in terms of other options. I would think therapeutic foster care, again, pros and cons of that, but have we exhausted every single other option? It kind of depends on if you're kind of going up or going down the levels of care, obviously, in the individual kid, all the circumstances. Also, this would be a good time to mention the rapid response team. I don't know if folks know about that the state operates, where every single day they talk about these hard to place, hard to serve, underserved kids that we're talking about today. And so that can be a great resource where the MCOs are at the table, the state, DSS, et cetera. So that's not, there's an individual client where that's not been explored yet, getting some more information about the rapid response team would be an avenue. Would you say, is that fair? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. Well,
and I think
oh, go ahead, Kirby.
I was going to say there's also consult abilities with places like Murdoch Developmental Center, Duke, and CIDD. They do medication and really looking at the diagnostics. Nobody has 5 diagnoses. Usually it's trauma plus something. And we seem to see like all these things are divided out when oftentimes they fall more into an umbrella of a bigger issue, which is usually PTSD. In my opinion, you see the mood dysregulation, you see the ADHD, you see the oppositional defiance, you see the spacing out, the dissociative type symptoms of kids that have just experienced systemic trauma. But I would also, and familial trauma and generational trauma, and I could go on. But I think at the end of the day, what we're talking about is whatever we can do to minimize that impact and reintegrate is imperative. Janu and I had a case where they were trying to provide capacity for a young man who had an IEP and had an innovations waiver. We are never going to get this child to have capacity. That's
right.
not a thing.
Yes. And actually, Kirby, that's an example I was going to kind of wrap this up with, at your exact example. So I know that we went right to the same place. And we're coming up on time, but an example that I wanted to offer, as you're kind of working through this information, is that, Ms. Morrow was contacted by a defense attorney and a social worker who were working with a child who was going up for disposition in a juvenile justice matter. And this child had a severe intellectual and developmental disability, as well as other unmet mental health needs. And the fear that the defense attorney had was that the judge was going to require the child to go to one of our state hospitals until capacity could be restored, because they'd already had 2 determinations that this child did not have the capacity to proceed in disposition. So they worked tirelessly with the MCO, the Department of Social Services, the Department of Juvenile Justice. Everybody was at the table. They found a group home to take this child, and the services to wrap around this child, and the innovations services for the developmental disability. They had this entire package. So their fear was that despite this really incredible package they'd put together to support the needs of this child, that the child was instead going to be sent to the state hospital. So late one evening, Ms. Morrow and I were working back and forth. We wrote a memo that described the placement that had been identified, why it was clinically appropriate, why the hospital placement was clinically inappropriate, tied in with the legal backing to why legally this was a supportable solution. And then we provided that to the juvenile justice defender and the caseworker. That was put forward at hearing. The judge read it, the judge was convinced, and then that is what was ordered in the disposition. So utilizing the evidence-based knowledge that is what Dr. Lanier produces, as well as the clinical knowledge, which is what Ms. Morrow produces, and the legal knowledge, which is what sat with me, we were able to really shift the direction for that child. And I think that's what we all hope to do, regardless of where the specific legal area is that we're working in, is we really want to be able to leverage our positions as lawyers to be able to shift the trajectory of a child and a family that may otherwise be bound to a legal system, for the rest of their lives. That's what we're really hoping to do. Which is why I value Dr. Lanier and Ms. Morrow so much for what they do, because it really does take all of us, coming together in our various areas of expertise. And so we have about a minute left. I've been monitoring the questions in the chat, and I know that we don't have a lot of time here for questions, but you will get copies of the slides. You will get the contact information for our panelists. Is there any burning last question that anyone would like to raise, or an announcement that anyone would like to bring forward before we close out for today? I see a thank you in the chat.
It looks like we did our job.
Well, you did, yes.
But at the end of the day, just know that we're reachable, and we want to try to help on these situations, because we understand people don't know what they don't know. But we have that knowledge. You have access to people that have that knowledge. I help attorneys all the time. Usually it's reviewing assessments for them. The problem is that a lot of those assessments are very predictive, and I will probably be recommending another assessment. So sometimes they think I'm psychic, and I'm like, no, not psychic, just used to it. Once you've read, 300 of them, you realize most of them look very similar.
Right. And so I hope that, like I said, I hope this has started a conversation between us on this really important matter. I just read yesterday that there is a pilot court in the eastern part of the state that is a mental health court. It's the first that we have, because it recognizes that so many of the adults in the criminal justice system become justice involved because of unmet mental health needs. And so they're piloting a program there where individuals that have not been convicted or charged of violent crimes, but simply crimes that are a manifestation out of their disability, will be given additional access to mental health services. I was so inspired by that. And I think together as attorneys that we can push forward suggestions like that for our kids in our respective areas, whether it's juvenile justice, education, child welfare, is that so many of these situations that our clients are in are have a mental health component underlying it. And I see one question: would you be willing to share my info with panelists regarding trans kids being hospitalized in North Carolina? Absolutely. I'm working with Duke trying to create best practices. Katie, yes, absolutely. Absolutely will do. So thank you everyone for taking time out of your very busy schedules. I know you're all doing just wonderful work out there. And please, feel free to drop me a line if you have any questions or you'd like to work on any type of panel like this, moving forward to just keep advancing this issue.